A Soviet submarine commander receives an order to launch nuclear weapons and decides the order itself might be fake. It's October 27, 1962. The B-59, a Soviet diesel-electric submarine, sits 300 meters below the surface of the Atlantic. 3 nuclear-armed torpedoes are locked in her tubes. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, has not heard from Moscow in days. Above, American destroyers are dropping depth charges not to sink him, but to force him to surface and identify himself. He doesn't know it yet. But the world is closer to nuclear annihilation than it's ever been. Let me rewind. The Cuban Missile Crisis began 13 days earlier when American reconnaissance planes photographed Soviet missiles being assembled in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy demanded their removal. Soviet Premier Khrushchev refused. The world held its breath. And in Moscow, the Soviet Navy made a decision that would almost kill millions. They ordered 4 submarines to Cuba, each carrying nuclear weapons. The B-59 was one of them. Here's what makes this particular mission different from every other Cold War near-miss. The B-59's nuclear torpedo, this specific weapon, right here in the record, wasn't a strategic deterrent. It was tactical, designed to be fired at point-blank range, close enough that the blast would destroy the submarine itself along with whatever it hit. The captain would be signing his own death warrant and his crews along with it. Savitsky was no reckless officer. Born in 1923, he'd survived the Great Patriotic War. That's what Soviets called World War II. He understood death. He understood orders. He was, by all accounts, a loyal man. But he was also something else. He was a thinking man, and thinking men make the best commanders when the stakes are highest. For days, the B-59 had been moving through the Atlantic under radio silence. This was standard procedure. Submarines don't broadcast their location. But it also meant Savitsky was completely cut off. No news from home, no updates on negotiations, no clarification on his rules of engagement, just the sound of his own propellers and the depth charges getting closer. Then on the morning of October 27th, something happened. The depth charges intensified. The American Naval Task Force above had detected the submarine and was trying to force it up. Inside the B-59, the crew was panicked. The pressure hull groaned, equipment rattled, men looked at their captain, waiting for orders, and Savitsky made a decision: he would surface. But here's where it gets stranger. According to the declassified records we have access to now, and I'm looking at the documentation right here, Savitsky believed the depth charges were a prelude to an actual attack. He thought war had already started, and if war had started, then his standing orders were clear: use the nuclear torpedo to defend the ship. He called a meeting in the officers' quarters. The ship's political officer, Ivan Maslennikov, was there. The chief engineer, Alexei Orlov, was there. Savitsky laid out the situation with brutal clarity. We are under attack. We have nuclear weapons. We have the authority to use them. Should we fire? Maslennikov, the political officer, said yes. Launch the torpedo. His reasoning was ideological and military. They were under attack. The orders allowed it. Duty demanded it. Orlov, the engineer, said yes as well. The 3 senior officers of the B-59 had made their decision. 1 nuclear warhead was armed. The firing sequence was initiated. All that remained was the captain's final order. And Savitsky hesitated. He did not give the order. This moment, right here in the captain's quarters of a Soviet submarine with the nuclear weapon armed and ready, this is the moment that saved the world. Not Kennedy's diplomacy, not Khrushchev's eventual backing down. This one man's pause. Savitsky realized something crucial. The depth charges hadn't killed them. The Americans were signaling, not attacking. And there was another detail that nagged at him: the orders he'd received before leaving port. They were vague, they were incomplete. They didn't explicitly authorize him to start a nuclear war. They suggested it, but they didn't demand it. And that tiny gap, that space between suggestion and demand, was where doubt lived. He ordered the nuclear torpedo disarmed. The other officers did not argue. The tension in that room, you can almost feel it in the archival accounts, evaporated. The B-59 surfaced. American sailors saw the Soviet flag. No shots were fired. No missiles launched. The submarine was escorted back to the surface and eventually allowed to return to the Soviet Union. When Savitsky returned to Moscow, he was not celebrated. The Soviet Navy was embarrassed by the incident. His decision to surface was seen as a retreat. He was quietly reassigned. For decades, this story remained classified. It wasn't until the Cold War ended and documents were declassified that we learned what had really happened in the depths of the Atlantic. What's remarkable about Savitsky isn't that he was a hero. He didn't see himself that way. He was simply a captain who thought clearly under pressure. He questioned his orders. He considered the consequences. He chose doubt over certainty. And in that choice, he did something no general, no politician, no diplomat managed to do during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He prevented nuclear war not through negotiation, but through the most human act of all: restraint. Savitsky died in 1999, long after the Cold War ended. He never gave interviews about that day. He never wrote a memoir. The B-59 was eventually scrapped, but the decision made in her captain's quarters echoes across history as a reminder. The world's survival sometimes depends not on weapons or strategy, but on individual judgment, on a single person choosing to pause. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended days later when both superpowers stepped back from the brink. But if you trace the timeline, if you look at the actual sequence of events, the B-59 incident happened at the absolute peak of tension. Savitsky's refusal to launch came before Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to stand down. In a real sense, he saved them from having to make that choice at all. We live in a world where nuclear weapons still exist, where submarines still patrol the depths with world-ending firepower, where the decisions of a handful of people can reshape civilization in seconds. Understanding the B-59 incident matters because it shows us something we desperately need to know. Restraint is possible. Judgment is possible. Even in the darkest moment, a thinking person can choose not to press the button. Subscribe to this channel. Every week we uncover the classified moments that almost changed history and the people whose judgment shaped the world we live in.